How did the Japanese adapt to Australian improvements in jungle fighting TTPs? We look at the Japanese lessons learnt process.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 122 of the Principles of War podcast, Japanese adaptation to jungle warfare 1942 to 1945. This is the fifth episode in our series with Dr Adrian Threlfall looking at Australian Army jungle warfare doctrine development in the Second World War. This episode's going to look at the development of the Jungle Scales Division for the Australian Army and in particular the impact that that had on combined arms. We're then going to look at the development of the Owen Gun, and finally we're going to finish off with how the Japanese adapted to the changing way in which the Australian Army operated in the jungle. So let's get right back into the interview with Dr Adrian Threlfall. So you've mentioned the Jungle Scales Division a little bit. How successful was that? And did it, after they made that initial change to the Jungle Scales Orbat, did they tweak with it over time? What did they learn from it?
Yeah, there's a number of little changes. They realised pretty quickly that they don't have enough transport, that even though your division has gone from roughly 17,800 down to about 14,000, getting rid of those units that have decided they're extraneous. The one problem is transport. We never have enough Jeeps. Basically, the Willys Jeep is what everybody wants. Americans in Europe, in North Africa, everybody wants those. The Bren gun carriers have been proven as to be a disaster in combat, and I mean they just get bogged down and stuck in the mud at Milne Bay and at the beachheads. They are not the solution. They come up with what they call a jungle cart, which has got basically like great big tyres, and you basically have two blokes or four blokes towing it. So a little cart, aluminium cart you put ammunition, food, whatever you need into it, and blokes have to tow it and pull it. It's seen as a solution, but in the end it isn't. Basically, Jeeps with trailers is the solution. And if you can get them around the beachhead areas, you have the American 6x. So they're four-wheel drive trucks with the six wheels. They're very useful also. But for moving supplies forward, it's going to be Jeeps or it's going to be porters, either indigenous porters if you have them, Papua New Guinean porters, or the men themselves, the soldiers themselves. And at times, when they're fighting when 9 Div is fighting at Lay and Satelberg in that area there, a lot of the time you'll have 2 units in combat and 1 battalion, just on supply, and you'll rotate. Your 3rd battalion is in reserve, but it's kind of not in reserve because it's actually manhandling and carrying ammunition forward for the units in combat, in contact. So I think that's one of the issues is that, yes, you have more teeth, you've got more blokes at the front line with weapons, but the problem with losing those sort of 4,000 men out of the division, you don't have as much support. And it's obviously in the jungles and in those mountainous terrain, it's about getting supplies forward. And you need people, you need men to lug that gear up forward, that ammunition, the food, the water, up to the front line. And that's what takes extra men. So yeah, you actually, as I said, you reduce your fighting capacity by a third for a lot of these campaigns because your blokes are rotating, your battalions are rotating through as porters.
The basic weapon of the infantry in the jungle, so originally they had the 303. Do you want to talk a little bit about the development of the Owen Gun?
Yep. Obviously, in North Africa, the automatic weapon that we get issued with is a Thompson submachine gun. Stand guns, Australian forces never get stand guns. Obviously, too many units in Europe and British units have them. We are way down the pecking order. So Australian units, divisions, 6, 7 and 9 division in the Middle East, never use stand guns. They're issued with American Thompson submachine guns. The French had ordered a whole bunch of them before the fall of France. And the first ones that 6th Division receives in North Africa are actually ones that are supposed to go to the French. We know that because the instruction manuals are all written in French. So they clean the grease off them and try to decipher what these manuals are saying to use them. But as people would understand, they're a more complex weapon, they're a heavier weapon, they're more difficult to keep sufficiently clean that they will operate properly. I mean, it had been a problem in the desert too. The sand obviously jams up. Sand is awful on any mechanism, and particularly any firearm, and particularly an automatic weapon, but it's even more so in the jungle. So it's pretty soon realised by 6th and 7th Division that the Thompson, yes, it's a good hard-hitting weapon, but it isn't the answer to an automatic weapon. Bren guns are fantastic. They all like the Bren guns as their sort of a light support weapon. They would, I think Australians and British, having come up against Spandau's, MG38s, and I guess later on maybe MG42s, would have loved that sort of a belt-fed weapon at the support level rather than sort of the Vickers for the medium machine gun. But it's understood pretty quickly that we need a submachine gun. And Evelyn Owen in 1941, he's a private, joins the army and becomes as a private, starts tinkering with 22 caliber for a submachine gun and comes up with what becomes the Owen gun, as I said initially in 22 caliber. He's knocked back. One, he's only a private, even though he'd been sort of an inventor before the war, and he was seen as just a bit of a crank, I guess, not well regarded. And if Australia did require a submachine gun, we'd get it through the normal chain of procurement, not through some bloke coming in off the street and saying, I've invented this gun. Do you want to have a look at it? Do you think it'll be useful? And at about the same time, obviously, the Osten is being invented. And there's a big battle, obviously, over the course of the war, really, about whether it should be the Osten or the Owen gun that is used by our frontline units. As we know, eventually the Owen gun in 9mm parabellum is what is adopted, and that proves a great benefit and is the most popular of those two weapons. Interestingly, the Osten is used by sort of Z Force a lot, and those units operating behind the lines seem to use it quite a bit, and units back in Australia are issued with it a lot. I mean, there's tens of thousands of them. I think there's about 40,000 Owens that are invented, but there's still about 30,000 Ostens that are invented. I haven't found photos of 6, 7 or 9 divisions or the militia divisions using Ostens in combat. But as I said, some of those cavalry commando units and some of their Z Force certainly does use it to an extent. But yeah, the Owen, with relatively pretty idiot-proof, able to be banged around and dropped in the mud and in water and still fire, becomes the weapon of choice. And by the end of the war, you read accounts of Australian rifle sections, and that's almost a misnomer. They say by the end of the war, every section has a Bren gun, everybody else has Owen guns, and there's one bloke with a 303. And the only reason there's one bloke still with your standard short magazine Lee Enfield 303, because it's got the EY, the grenade discharger cup on the end. And obviously that is very important, being able to project and propel a hand grenade 50, 80, 150 metres into Japanese positions. So it's a total reversal. Obviously earlier in the war, you'd have one Bren gun for the platoon, you'd have everybody else with rifles. Probably your platoon commander or your company commander would have a Thompson submachine gun, and maybe one or two other men, one of the sergeants would have a Thompson submachine gun, but everybody else would have rifles. So it's a complete reversal by the end of the war. And you read accounts by the Japanese in that sort of 44, 45 period, and they say that it's terrifying fighting against the Australians in the jungle, because as soon as you shoot at them, there's a wall of automatic weapons fire comes back at you, and that you all have to go to ground or you're all dead. That change, I would argue, saves lives. Yes, it means an awful lot of ammunition is used up, and that's again why you need an awful lot of porters, or you need a really good logistics supply chain along with those porters. But I would argue that saves lives, Owen's gun, and automatic weapons in general.
And was that one Bren per section?
Yep. So earlier you would have had, for the platoon, would have had a Bren gun, had a light support group, and you have a gun group, and by the end of the war, a lot of those units, a lot of the battalions are borrowing or stealing automatic weapons. I mean, to an extent you see it in the Middle East too. There's like the Italian breeders, and I've seen plenty of photos of Australians at Tobruk using MG38s, so using the Spandau's. But yeah, you've got, whether it's official or not, you've got many of those platoons, a platoon of 35 men with, in theory, should just be one Bren gun, but a Bren gun for each section. When you go out, you want to have at least one Bren gunner with his second in command as well. So yeah, it's extraordinary firepower.
So we've talked a lot about fighting in the jungle, But Freddie Spencer Chapman spoke. His book was titled "The Jungle is Neutral." What did we learn about the Japanese and their specific way of war? Because it was, and I think this was part of their early success, was they had a very specific way of war. How did we learn around that?
Yeah, I think initially, certainly in Malaya and in those initial campaigns, obviously Kokoda and Milne Bay, that their ferocity was off-putting. The fact that they would fight to the death, that they would not surrender, that they would keep attacking, they would keep charging. But there's accounts even as Kokoda is going on. So there's accounts in September 42 saying that the Japanese are tactically naive, which is one of the quotes I remember, that they will do the same thing over and over again. So some of those charges that are terrifying that happen along the Kokoda track, you hear the talking and their noise discipline is appalling. All the Australians talk about that. Then you hear the chants start up, then you'll hear the bugle calls coming, and they'll come charging out of the jungle at you. And as long as you've got enough firepower, and at this stage they often don't, as I said, there's only the occasional Bren gun and 303s and hand grenades, you can knock the Japanese back. And then 10 minutes, half an hour later, they'll do exactly the same thing again. Tempered this, I would say that yes, at times they do try to outflank. And that catches out, we talked a little bit about 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th. They get outflanked and then they fall back. It's not as precipitous and as disastrous, I would argue, as in Malaya, but certainly it does at times trigger premature withdrawals where it would have been, arguably, looking back, better to have stayed in position and to have done all around defence. But with your uncertainty of your supply chain behind you, the fact that there's not enough DC-3 Dakotas, you can't get enough porters up to your front line, and it's really hard to evacuate your wounded again because your porters have got to carry them out. Australian commanders keep feeling they need to withdraw to get to a firmer base, obviously, instead of standing and fighting. But I think as they're going on, the Australians start to realise that, there's nothing really special or novel about their tactics of the Japanese. It's just that they're ferocious and they're willing to give their lives no matter what. But they tactically there's nothing special about them. It's attacking front on, and then if you can, you move to the flanks, outflank, and then keep moving. So you read accounts later on in the war, sort of 44, 45, and the Australians are saying there's no new lessons to be learnt from these campaigns. So that the Japanese aren't adjusting and adapting new tactics as they're going on. I mean, to an extent there is. There's they're using some sort of sticky bombs and satchel charges to try and take out our tanks, to take out the Matildas. So there is things like that. Or they're using their handful of anti-tank guns and they're sighting them. They're masters of camouflage, the Japanese. Everybody talks about that in the war. And obviously tropical growth grows really fast, funnily enough. Heat and rain means foliage grows, plants grow. So, and with their bravery, they wait until Matildas are on top of them, basically, before they open fire. So, but I'd argue there's not really anything innovative about their tactics at the platoon or the company or the battalion level throughout the rest of the war.
I think it's one of the things that is very interesting about the Japanese army. If you look at their combat performance at Nomonhan, they really do come up short in a combined arms battle. And there's 6 years between that and the end of the war, and they really struggle to come up with an answer to that question of how do you generate a combined arms effect and how do you fight against an enemy that creates a combined arms effect. And that is probably, off the top of my head, the biggest failing of the Japanese army, is that they're not able to answer that question.
Yep, I think I'd agree with you. Part of it is also about supply chain issues. By, I'd say, mid-43, the United States Navy, their submarine fleet, is sinking just about everything, every merchant ship that the Japanese have. And as many people still don't acknowledge, that the focus of the Japanese army is always on China. That is the key priority. It's China and then in Burma. The Southwest Pacific is actually third on their order of priorities. Burma is important because that's how And the Allies, Americans and British, are getting supplies to Chiang Kai-shek's forces, so over the hump, or those supplies sort of through northern Burma there. So those China and Burma are the areas that are more important. And also the almost extraordinary rivalry and sometimes hatred between the Japanese army and the Japanese navy about priorities, about tasking, and about support. So many of those Japanese commanders serving in the Southwest Pacific don't have the weapons at their disposal. They don't have armour. I mean, yes, we know there's the handful of 2 or 3 tanks that are landed at Milne Bay and get bogged down very quickly. They're successful briefly and terrify the members of the 18th Brigade, but they bogged down very quickly and are disabled and abandoned by their crews. Tanks, so yeah, after that, they're hardly used by the Japanese at all. And they don't use artillery at the same level that any other military uses, whether Western or Germans or the Russians or anyone like that. They use them in fixed defences, and obviously really from mid-42 onwards, which is obviously when Yamamoto said we would be able to run riot until sort of June 42, which he was basically correct. They're putting their artillery pieces in their fixed defences. They want to basically have what we hold. So keep Truk, Guam, keep that ring of steel basically, and they even strip artillery pieces off old destroyers and old cruisers and use them in fixed defences. So they don't really have to any sort of Western level of howitzers and artillery pieces that the Australian and the American militaries do. And obviously they don't have the naval gunfire support to support their fixed defences anywhere else in the Southwest Pacific. So you're right, they don't develop that combined arms. They do to an extent in China, but even as you've said, not really satisfactorily, not when they come up against a military that can fight at those full-scale conventional warfare. Yes, if they're fighting against communist guerrillas or whatever, and it's small scale in China, or when Chiang Kai-shek hasn't got his full forces, they can defeat them and push them back, but they can't when they're fighting against Western forces throughout the Pacific, or the Russians, as you've mentioned.
So you've done a really, really good job of going through the doctrine development and then how the Australian Army trained soldiers to be able to use that doctrine to be able to generate combat power and defeat the Japanese. Obviously now the Australian Army's got the Army Knowledge Centre, and what do you think the lessons are for the future when it comes to looking back to our doctrine development process, given the fact that it's likely that we're going to potentially be utilised in similar terrain, but probably in a different way that the enemy fights? What are your thoughts about looking forward from what we've learned?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Obviously, after the Second World War, Army and government decides we're not going to do this again. This was an anomaly. Canungra is closed down as soon as the war's over. November 45, Canungra is closed down. 10 years. It's not re-established until 1955, and that's when we first going to deploy a battalion to Malaya. So nothing to do with Vietnam at that stage. It's going to be fighting CTs, communist terrorists, in Malaya. So we re-establish it, and obviously then Canungra exists since then. But you're right, it's a discussion of what sort of scale of warfare you're going to be involved in. If it's the small-scale patrolling of Malaya, that's very different than some of the more conventional fighting, which doesn't happen much, but the Australian Army is engaged in, I guess, in 1968, really. The defences, I guess, of fire bases Coral and Balmoral, the use of the tanks at Baria, so again in 68, sort of June, July in 68. But the last sort of battalion level fighting that the Australian Army is involved in, you'd have to say is Kap Yong and Mariang San in the Korean War, so in April and October 51. So, yeah, as you said, what sort of scale of warfare? I mean, I think you need to be able to live, survive, move, operate in the jungle, as we were saying earlier. It's that before you even really think about fighting. How do you move through the jungle? How do you supply your forces in the jungle? How do you resupply them? How do you move artillery? Does artillery fly? Again, if there's no tracks, how do you move your artillery pieces? How do you move your tanks? But it can be done. It was proven, obviously, in the Second World War. The tanks are an extraordinary force multiplier, and they save infantry lives. They always have done, and they always will do. But again, Abrams are rather big compared to a Matilda, or a rather heavy also. But yeah, I think it's about knowing and being comfortable in that terrain, being comfortable in that environment, being able to operate in that environment, being able to, for the Australians, they established relationships with locals. Too much has been said about the fuzzy wuzzy angels. An awful lot of them were basically indentured labourers. They weren't doing it out of the goodness of their own hearts. They were basically conscripted to be supported, to be porters and to supply. So those relations with those nations in our region, I think, are critical, obviously. And obviously that's a DFAT thing, or as well as defence. But I think that's why, Kanungra is still critically important, and being confident and comfortable in that terrain, in that environment, working with the Papua New Guinean Defence Force, or working in the Solomon Islands, working with the Indonesian Defence Force, or whoever it is, being able to, basically being able to operate and train in those areas, and have, I guess, like the US Marine Corps or whichever force you're looking at, have the ability to manoeuvre in the littoral. Because if we're going to be fighting in our region, we need to be able to comfortably and satisfactorily move our forces quickly to different parts of an extraordinary terrain that has thousands of islands. So our knowledge of the area, that was one of the main problems in the Second World War, is the maps were non-existent, or if they did exist, they were crap and they were inaccurate. Every artillery unit moans and bewails the fact that they spent their whole time doing survey work and basically creating gridded maps so they could then provide artillery support. I guess it's just about capturing the lessons and making sure that they are easily retrievable. I know in the Vietnam War, a commander of one artillery unit that was about to be deployed, so one of the 105 batteries, he could find nothing about how to use his unit in the jungle. Eventually, he managed to track down a lieutenant colonel who'd been a commander of one of the 25-pounder field artillery regiments in the Second World War. And he basically picked his brains and found a couple of documents that he'd kept. But, so 25 years after the Second World War, he couldn't find anywhere. I'm sure it was kept somewhere. There would have been the unit war diaries were kept, but he didn't know where to look to find the lessons about it. Particularly, he said he wanted to know about sound ranging, obviously an artillery term. And so, you need to be able to have a relatively quickly and easily searchable resource to find what people have done before. Yes, the weapons are going to be different now, but some of the challenges are still going to be similar, if not the same, as they were in the Second World War, or in Malaya in the late 50s, or in Vietnam in the late 60s. It's still going to be many of those problems. Even comms, obviously. Yes, I'm sure they're better now, but if you've been to Papua New Guinea, you need a sat phone. You're going to try and use your normal phone or use other forms of comms. Often it's unpredictable in tropical conditions.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. A very detailed look at doctrine development and training for the kind of terrain that I think is the most difficult type of terrain that there is, when you look at all of the challenges that our soldiers are presented once they step foot in the jungle. It is neutral, but I think it's only neutral in that it hates everyone. And that really does add to the complexity, particularly when you add the fact that there's an enemy in there that's trying to do ill towards you. So thank you very much. It's been a very valuable series of lessons on our very, very rich history in fighting in the jungle, and I'm sure it's going to set everyone up for success if we ever have to do it again. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Great to talk to you.
So yes, a very big thank you to Dr Adrian Threlfall. His expertise in the area well and truly on display in the last 5 episodes that we've done. A large number of lessons for us to learn about the lessons learnt process and how that feeds into doctrine development. Reflecting back on this episode, one of the key things that comes out to me is the story of the development of the Owen Gun. This is something that we don't often think about too much. When we change the way that we fight, what are the weapons that we're going to need? What are the effects that we're going to want to create on the battlefield? In the jungle, the contacts were often quite sudden, and they were at short range. And so the troops were looking for a large volume of fire as they looked to regain the initiative over the enemy. They needed a fair amount of stopping power because the round would need to punch through multiple layers of jungle canopy before it got to the enemy. It didn't need to be accurate at long range because the contacts were at short range. When we're thinking about capability development, we need to think about the fundamental inputs to capability that were required for the development of product like the Owen Gun. So we needed the manufacturing base. We needed the engineering talent to be able to come up with the design. We had that in the manufacturing capability at John Lysart's in Port Kembla, which would go on to be bought out by BHP. We also had it in the engineering capability of Evelyn Owen. Both of these were critical because we weren't able to source submachine guns from our traditional partners because there was a world war going on and we were very low down the priority list. The outcome of that development process saw the creation of a gun that had all of the capability needs that the soldiers required. It was easy to maintain, especially when it was being used in the jungle, very rugged, capable of a high rate of fire, and creating the punch that was needed to be able to suppress the enemy. From guns including the 25-pounder, to ammunition, to aircraft, to even ships. It was estimated that the gun cost somewhere between 8 and 12 pounds to produce. That's the equivalent of somewhere between $700 and $1,000 per weapon. The other thing I find amazing about the Owen Gun is I remember back to our interview with Harry Smith from Delta Company 6RAR during the Battle of Long Tan. The Australian Army was still equipping soldiers with the Owen Gun in 1966. On that note, we will finish the podcast and we'll return next week.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.